welcome to Down in Bloomington, a conversational podcast about the musical history of Bloomington, Indiana. Today's guest has authored 2 memoirs about his experience growing up in Bloomington, Indiana. Burdeshaw is the author of All the Best Stories Start with a Bad Decision and I Opened My Mouth to Vomit and All I Got Were Words. Burd sat down with us to discuss the punk rock tribe and the music scene in Bloomington, Indiana during the 1980s and 90s.
Place yourself in Bloomington and place yourself in the local music scene back when you were young and kind of how that evolved around.
Okay, I mean, it's spelled out in the first story of the book. But, so, I was born in Bloomington, raised in Bloomington, and went through schools here. And when I tell my children about it, they're just, school was like that. I was like, yeah, we had to fucking fight with our fists.
Right.
Other students.
Yep.
You know, a lot. So I kind of came up through middle school and got kind of hooked into what my parents would have called the wrong crowd. But these were like lower working class kids. Mm-hmm. And, you know, we listened to heavy metal. I think the biggest thing at the time was, AC/DC's Back in Black album had come out a few years previous. The second drummer with the one arm, Def Leppard record had come out, and people were just, and I was all into that shit. And Iron Maiden and you know, just all that kind of metal that was coming through then. And, you know, I was actually getting a little, because the second AC/DC record had come out, For Those About to Rock, and I was like, wow, this sounds a whole lot like Back in Black. Mm-hmm. Just a whole lot like.
Right.
There was very definite, and it was my first experience figuring out that bands would find, you know, this blueprint. And once they found a successful blueprint, they stayed on it. Up until that time, AC/DC was really bluesy, and they were kind of all over the place before their first singer died. Mm-hmm. So when that came out, I was like, yeah, that's a great record. And then the second one came out, and I was like, wow, that's a lot like Back in Black. And then Def Leppard did it. And I was like, wow, that sounds a lot like, you know, their previous record. And I was like, and this was starting to happen. And I was like, well, that's not what I want. Well, I liked it when the bands explored. And, you know, I liked it when AC/DC found a new sound and went all in on it. And, you know, I was like, wow, because that's so much different than Bon Scott. And I thought they would continue doing that, and they didn't continue doing that. I still like AC/DC.
Right.
I still love that band, but at the time, I think I was looking for something else. And it's in the first story, but I got arrested with these guys for fucking around with pellet guns. You know, it started out like we were going to prank people walking down the street and shoot each other. We had these ketchup packages we got from McDonald's. We were going to explode them on our chest and fall down, and we thought that shit would be funny. Well, somehow that didn't happen, and one of the guys who was dressed like the cop and had the pellet gun decided to start fucking with, instead of pointing the gun at his buddies, he was pointing it at strangers.
Oh, no.
Yeah. So it became a whole thing really quick.
Police involved?
Police were involved. Yeah. You know, I think, and it ended with me, you know, down on the corner where Kilroy's is on Kirkwood and Dunn. Mm-hmm. You know, for some dumbass reason, trying to get home, we heard all these sirens. And he was like, oh, turn down Kirkwood and go up Dunn, and we'll get back to my friend Bill's house at the time. And we see a cop way down on Indiana, sideways. We're like, turn on Dunn! And there's another cop. They had just pulled in and blocked all the streets. And then all of a sudden, they were all around us, all pointing their guns, real guns.
Right.
Gonna, you know, blow us away. And so that wasn't even the worst part. The worst part was my dad picking me up, because I had one of these old blue collar dads who was pretty heavy handed, and and the first story is really hard for people to get through.
Yeah.
We could talk about when I sent that to publishers.
Yeah.
Because they always ask for the first 100 pages.
Right.
Which is probably the reason I was rejected from over 50 different publishing houses, because they read that and were like, this is not what we're after at all. We weren't into a child abuse book.
Right.
So I was, from that moment on, I was not allowed to hang out with those boys anymore.
Right.
So I'm at school, and my dad would do this thing where you would be, if I had a bad report card, I'd be grounded till the next report card, which is like 9 weeks.
Yeah.
Well, this was like that, except forever. Forever.
Indefinite.
Yes. You were in your room, he went in there, pulled out the TV, the stereo. He left my bookcase. He's like, "You so smart, read some books." So that's what I did all summer long until the next school started up, and then I was still in that. But then I had other kids I could finally talk to and things like that. And so there was this kid named Tom who I'd known coming up through middle school. This was like sophomore year of high school when all this happened, and Tom sat in front of me in English class, and I'd draw on my folder Flying V guitars, and try to draw the exact way Kiss made their logo, or AC/DC made it with the little diamond things at the bottom, or
every notebook I had was,
just covered with graffiti. And one night I had been listening to my mom, after a while, browbeat my father into letting me listen to my radio if I put my headphones on it. The big headphones, kind of like what you're wearing right now. As long as he didn't have to hear the shit, he was fine. And so one late night, Q95 or one of those stations in Indianapolis, when it got to a later hour, they kind of let their DJs off the chain sometimes.
Right.
So this DJ was playing all this glam rock stuff. He's playing Bowie and the New York Dolls and Iggy Pop and a bunch of stuff, Sweet and things like that. And so, as I was listening, I was writing down these names on that folder. Yeah. And, I'm in English class, and me and Tom would banter all the time about music and metal and all this stuff. And he looks at the folder and he goes, Iggy Pop, Stooges. That's pretty punk rock, man. I'm like, really? It's punk rock? It sounded pretty rock and roll to me. And he's like, oh, yeah. And then, he's going on, and he's like, have you heard hardcore? I was like, hardcore? Like the porn? So I remember that George C. Scott had made that movie called Hardcore, which was about the porn industry in the 70s. He's like, no, man, hardcore punk. I'm like, I don't know what the fuck you're talking about. Sounded familiar. And he started naming off bands like Black Flag and things like that. And I was like, kind of sounds familiar. And I went back through Hit Parader magazine, which was like this rock and roll magazine, a couple nights later, because I was like, man, it just ate on me, because he was really up at this whole punk rock thing, how it was harder than metal. I was like, it's not harder than Sabbath. It's like, oh yeah, it's harder than Sabbath and nastier than Sabbath, and you gotta listen to it. And so I was intrigued, but the name Black Flag kept running through my mind. I was like, I'd seen that somewhere before. So I went through my Hit Paraders, and I'd found this little article this guy had done, and it's a really forward-thinking article. If you read it, he's talking about heavy metal and hardcore punk crossing over. He's like, and the end is something like, if you like AC/DC, and I know you do, you're gonna be really stoked about a band 5 years from now who combines the hardcore mythos of heavy metal with the raw intensity of punk rock. Mark my words. And fuck yeah, then it wasn't too much later. Yeah, it happened. So started hanging out with Tom. Was able to browbeat my mom into going over to his house to listen to this music. Yes, I'd never heard it. I didn't know where to get it. The only time I got to a record store was with my parents when they'd go to the mall for whatever, go to Sears or something. I could stop at the Disc Jockey. I don't even remember this record store that was in. Yeah. And it was all Pat Benatar, and Merle Haggard, and just
whatever was top 40.
Whatever was popular in those genres at that time. And there was nothing. I think there probably was a Blondie record, maybe. if I had dug deep enough and knew, there probably was a Sex Pistols record buried in there somewhere from Warner Brothers. I mean, they might have had one copy, but certainly didn't have any Black Flag or Circle Jerks or Bad Brains or any of these bands that my friend was telling me about. So we go to his house, and he has Let Them Eat Jelly Beans and All's Quiet on the Western Front compilations. Yeah. And he plays these for me, and it's one of those, I think everyone who's ever gotten attached to the punk rock movement, or, at least from that decade, had that moment where your brain just exploded. Yeah. And you said, oh my God, this is what I want to be involved with. And from then on, it was on. It was, first slowly got out from underneath my parents' boot heel, and because they were really happy I had new friends.
Right.
And these new friends were a little bit smarter, a little more intellectual. I'd start talking about current events, and my parents are like, "Who is this fucking
A little
kid?"
more well-read, a little more.
A little more well-read, yeah. A little, they were they were in band class. Mm-hmm. They got A's on their report cards. This were the kind of people my parents wanted me hanging out with, until they met them, and then they were like, "Holy shit!" But it was a little too late to back out at that point. I was like, "What's this mohawks and spiked and all that stuff?"
Yeah.
But, so I managed to go to a Zero Boys concert for my first concert at this little club that these kids had taken over. This old hippie named Ricky had rented a place above the Salvation Army, which is now a parking garage on 4th and College. So if you imagine the second story of that parking garage all the way up against the building behind it, which was second story and all that stuff.
Right, and that's Ricky's
That's where
Cantina.
Ricky's Cantina was, yeah. And, I think he started with the idea it was going to be an all-ages club, and I think he was thinking blues and kind of the rock and roll that he knew.
Right.
But instead, all these little gnarly punk rockers got attached to it. And they did what you did back then. If you wanted a band to come to town, they wrote to the bands. Yeah. Or they got Maximum Rock and Roll, this magazine, that they would pick up at other hardcore shows around Indianapolis and stuff. And you'd flip it open and you'd find the telephone number of one of the guys from one of those bands. And you'd call them up and go, "Hey, if you're ever touring, here's my number in Indiana. Let me know." And these kids booked an awful lot of shows just doing shit like that. Just writing to a guy in a magazine that they'd never met. Yeah. Who's maybe one song they'd heard on a compilation record, because it was still kind of tough to get those records at that time. There was maybe 3 places that had them. Discount Den had a little import section. They were a little shop up above, just down from Kilroy's. I don't know what's there now.
Next to the Old Noble Roman.
Yeah, right? Which is not there either.
Right.
So it's hard to explain where that is. But and then there was a little store in the back of, there was a record store called Roscoe's in the back of Dunkirk Square. Mm-hmm. I think there's a falafel shop or something weird back there now. Yeah. Or there was. I haven't been back there in a while. And they had a little import section. Mm-hmm. And Ozarka up the hill, which is like this multi-ethnic Chinese, Thai, Korean, Japanese, kind of Asian fusion restaurant. Yeah. That was a record store. And you could go to any of these stores and you just have to twirl through the records, my son goes, I was talking about him getting the Velvet Underground. Yeah. And, he just went online, found the best one he could find, and ordered it. I was like, dude, you don't understand how we had to find music back then. We had to just work for it. And I was like, even when we didn't have the money, we were cruising through those record stacks.
Did you ever buy something because you thought, oh, this is going to be so good, and then you brought it home and you're like, oh, this is garbage?
Probably. Yeah. I know that one of them was, it was Discharge. It was the Discharge, that band from England. Yeah. Like, I heard their first hardcore English record. I was, holy shit, this is great. And then I saw another Discharge record, and it was just some kind of crazy, like, operatic metal they were trying to do, but they were so bad at it. I still have the record. It was just a terrible record. Just terrible. And then there's records I saw that looked so bad that I knew they had to be good. I've got a record at home, and again, my son's amazed by this. There's this guy named Elvis Hitler, who at the time, do you remember Elvis Hitler? Yeah. It's kind of a rockabilly punk. sound, and I guess he didn't have money to print the first run of his records, like the case, the covers,
The sleeves.
so he got mailing sleeves and just slapped a sticker on them and sent those to record stores. So that's what I got. I've got
That's
this
awesome.
this cardboard mailing sleeve. It's like an inch thick with that record in, and when I listened to that record, I was like, I knew it. I knew this record was going to be awesome. Just because how bad and how poorly, but how you could also tell that he was determined to get this record out. You know, he ran out of money, couldn't print sleeves off, so let's go down to the post office and buy cardboards, send those out to record stores. So yeah, but yeah, that's how I got into it. And then I dived in, and through high school it was nothing. The remainder of high school was nothing but, you know, hardcore punk rock and bands like that.
In your book, you talk about finding your tribe. You've published 2 volumes of memoir. And so the first one is All the Best Stories Start with a Bad Decision.
Yes.
And the second one is titled...
I opened my mouth to vomit, but all I got were words, which was a piece of graffiti up on the top end of Kirkwood in an alley. Yeah, I think the first story is about, it's called Finding My Tribe, and it was those kids, and it grew. The tribe grew as more people came in. The music was the impetus. It was the engine in the bus, but there was so much. There was an artistic bent to it. There was the fact that we were all oddballs and square pegs and misfits and nerds and just sometimes disagreeable little rabble rousers, and we all gelled together around this music, and we also lived in a time where expressing yourself the way we did with leather jackets or mohawks or pierced noses, different colored hair, stuff you see the kid who's serving you lattes at Starbucks or checking you out at Target, or, you know, working in a grocery store. Heck, now you see old ladies, older than me, with blue hair.
Yeah. And it's not the blue rinse stuff.
No, it's not the mistake, you know, where you talk about blue-haired old lady. That was a bright blue hair. It was so revolutionary and so different at the time that everyone hated us. Every single person. From all the other little subgenres of groups in high school, the jocks, the nerds, the rednecks especially. That was our biggest foe around town, was the country kids. Just couldn't stand us. It was war going to school, and I don't think people understand how dangerous it was simply to walk down the street with a leather jacket, with a couple buttons on it, and a weird haircut. You were just a target. And there was this camaraderie because of that, because everyone else, the frat boys at the university, the police didn't like us, teachers didn't like us. You know, I was stood up in a psychology class and used a couple times as examples of like antisocial behavior. She's like, stand up, Mr. Burdeshaw. He's a good example of antisocial behavior. It's like, you bitch. Really, you know? But, you know, I also had teachers that got it. I had old hippie art teachers that were like, yeah, we did almost the same thing. We did a little different. We were a little more mellow about it, but I understand what you're doing, and, you know, and could be supported in that way. But there were certainly the teachers, you know, old military guys that were just like, We had a really cohesive group, and it grew as we got out of high school and kids got into college. And then more kids, and this was the great part about this, and what made Bloomington kind of unique, was that other kids came from other parts of the country. And a lot of those kids were just like us. They had found the punk rock scene or alternative music at the time, whatever it had been, post-punk or just avant-garde weird stuff. And they brought all that with them, and they found us. And we all found each other. So there was no militarization of the punk rock aesthetic. There was no, this is the way you have to do it, which sometimes didn't work for me if I went out of town. There were uniforms that they thought you should wear. In the book, In the second book, I talk about all the different places I went and saw shows and things. And one was Indianapolis, and I had friends in Indianapolis. But it was a big scene up there, and they had a hardcore aesthetic that they stuck to. And when this long-haired kid from Bloomington came, because I kept my hair long, the reason being my dad loved short hair. Well, I didn't want to do anything he loved. I wanted to do the exact opposite of what he liked, so I kept long hair. And one of the few long-haired punks early in that scene. No. And but in Bloomington, it was whatever you could come up with. Right. Creativity was the key. You could just wear a skate T-shirt and some shorts, and we didn't care. Yeah. And then there were other people that went way, and I was one of those who get a little flashy or just kind of explore what you could do with clothing or stuff like that. And tattoos are huge now.
When did you start noticing a local music scene happening? When did you start noticing, hey, these bands are from here? This music is from here.
Immediately. I mean, because my friends' bands were opening for those bands that they called on the phone. Some of the earliest punk rock bands. One is playing. I brought you a flyer. On the 31st at the Blockhouse. This band called Yellow Rain.
Those are some of the members of Pitbulls on Crack, or
they're members from a lot of different bands. Yeah, Pitbulls on Crack and Moto X and just a bunch of different bands. Yeah. Ross Danielson and Greg Phillips have played in a bunch of Dan Fiersteven as the drummer has played in a bunch of different bands. But they were a band in like 1983, and I saw them at Ricky's Cantina. But come to find out, Yellow Rain was like this thing that the Reagan administration made up to explain like chemical warfare in Southeast Asia and stuff like that. So it's a very complicated history, and very topical for 1983 and no other time.
That's a good example, though, of kind of the kids that you were hanging out with being more informed than a lot
and just being engaged. Yeah, I thought nothing about politics until I got into punk rock, and then and that stuff rubs off on you. I mean, everything about the people I grew up with informed me as I was growing up. In the years I needed it to do that, right? So it was able to stick. My parents, like I said, loved it because my grades started going up because it wasn't cool to be dumb anymore. It kind of pushed you towards the more intellectual side and the political side, and thinking about your world and where your place in it, and creativity, and what was possible with music. Mm-hmm. I'm not a musician, but just exploring all of that stuff was.
Other than Ricky's Cantina, where else were you able to see shows back then?
So there's kind of a timeline, and it's the all ages thing kind of dried up. So Ricky's Cantina happened, and it closed. Parts of the Monroe County History Museum, which is the old library. And we had shows there. We saw Sam Hain, which just some epic stories from that guy, Glenn Danzig. Yeah. What a tool. Another big thing was basement shows and street dances. Eric White was the master of getting street dances.
This is the third time Eric White has been mentioned in one of these podcasts.
Oh, yeah. He was seminal purveyor of music and promoter of music in Bloomington. You cannot talk about Bloomington music without him. You just can't. At least those early years, all the way up through into the 90s. So he's semi-retired right now, kind of off the grid for a little bit. But Eric had told me one time when I had Rockets, my pizza place, Rockets Pizzeria, which I owned from 90 to 96.
Right, which we'll talk about.
Oh, okay. For sure. When it first opened, I wanted to go have a street dance in this vacant lot next to it. Mm-hmm. And I didn't know how he fucking did it. So I went in front of the city council, and they just eviscerated me. They just shut it down so hard, so fast. They did not give a fuck. They did even want, why was this guy taking up our time? And I was like, God damn, how does Eric do it? And I found out he would go to the street department, and he just needed to convince one guy. He built this relationship with one guy, said, hey, next Saturday, I'd like to a few Saturdays from now, I'd like to have the block between Lincoln and Washington on 6th Street shut down and have a little show. Is that cool? And everybody like, yeah, sure, no problem. And they shut it down, and Eric would then work on where he was getting the electricity from and, you know, the generators and all that stuff. And I had no idea until I wrote my books, and I went and asked him. And he told me this. I was like, God damn it, no wonder.
No wonder you couldn't get that.
No wonder I went in front. I don't know how many. I forget how many people are on the city council. 6, 8, something like that. But yeah, they were not having it. They did not care who this cretin was. And
so there were street dances, and those were mostly in that area around the library at that time.
Yeah, he had them all. He kind of had them all over. Sometimes he'd have them on Kirkwood. So most of the time it was on side streets. Yeah. I think probably because they were the easiest. Yeah. A couple times People's Park. A couple times 3rd Street Park. A couple times up near the square, he had some. I think he even had them on sidewalks a couple times, like right on main drag at Walnut Street. It might have been like on 6th between Walnut and Washington or something, but he just would get these, and they were great summertime events. I mean, you just looked forward to them. When I got to working at the Italian Villa, I missed a lot more than I got to see, but that went on to booking bands at places like, once we started getting older, like Second Story, Bluebird, Jake's. I think in between we had a little tiny places would start up and close down real quick. We had very briefly this place called 33 Steps.
Yeah. That I went to one show there.
Yeah, I think I maybe went to 2.
Yep.
And one of them I was just vomiting profusely at because a friend of mine gave me a bottle of cough syrup to drink. And we had an older, wiser music aficionado named Steve Millen, who was kind of like a big brother to all of us. You know, this was a guy who was over 10 years older than me. Mm-hmm. And also, you know, one of the first experiences I had befriending an openly gay man, mm-hmm. which up until that point, you know, you snicker or right. High school kind of. And then you find out this guy you know and love is a gay man, and you're like, oh, that's how that shit evaporates, you know?
Yep.
How that kind of like homophobia, high school stuff just leaves your body, because this is my friend. Yeah, Steve liked to get high on cough syrup, and he had a zine called Tussin' Up, seminal in keeping us entertained.
Yeah. I know there was Tussin' Up, and there was Gulcher had a zine. Mm-hmm. Were there other kind of?
Oh, there was tons. I got a list of a bunch of them in the beginning of the second book. Mickey's Pink Butthole was another one. This was a product of this group of women that were called lived in a house. We used to name our party houses. So they lived in a house called the House of Raging Women, and their zine was more feminist, mm-hmm. you know, poke you in the eye kind of centered, and just hilarious. If you can find old copies of it, just hilarious. There was a guy named Seth, also affectionately known as Mickey Malice, put out a bunch of different kinds of. He had Mickey Malice magazine. My favorite of his was Satan's Surreal Spaghetti Supper, which was a zine that was printed on black paper. Black ink on black paper. You had to go out in the sunlight and hold it at an angle to fucking read this thing. And, you know, it was just fantastic. But yeah, just tons of them. Osmosis and Diffusion. My friend Zach had one called a No Scene Boredom Zine. So there were the Natives. Was an early hardcore band. Moto X was an early punk band. I wouldn't call them hardcore, but they were definitely a punk rock band. I missed the Panics. They were very early, like the Gizmos were. They were kind of, the Gizmos and the Panics were kind of predated 1983 when I dropped into the scene. But, you know, they were talked about. And they were talked about with reverence all the way back then. Mm-hmm. The Gizmos, the Panics.
Right.
You know, those. So, but those bands would go on, especially the guys from the Panics, and form the Swamp Rats, and later the Walking Ruins, which became Bloomington's premier punk rock band.
Right.
those guys were troubadours. They played everywhere. I don't think they ever said no to a gig. I do not think they ever said no.
They were always ready to play.
I think they were. I think anyone said, "Hey, we're having a party tonight. Can you play?" Yes, we'll be there.
Yeah.
And then they showed up. Hey, I need someone to be on the bottom of this bill. Can you do it? Yes, absolutely. So yeah, the Blood Farmers were a band that was around. Killing Children was kind of an import from Columbus. So, and you can still find those records out there. Them and Killing Children and Blood Farmers both made little 7-inch records. And then later, again, all these bands morphed into other bands as the members mixed it up and moved around. Pitbull's on Crack was one of my favorite bands. And those guys went on to be like Trailside Killers, Joyride. Yeah. Especially when we hit 21 and hit the clubs, then they were mixing it up. Phil's band, Virginia Scrapings, they played my 21st birthday party.
You found a way to create a business that was music adjacent.
Yes.
And so when I first moved down here to Bloomington, several of my roommates and several of the people that I knew worked for you at Johnny Rocket's Pizza in varying capacities, most of them for a pretty short period of time. But Johnny Rocket's had the best jukebox in Indiana for a while.
We did.
And the walls were covered with memorabilia from, I'm guessing it was any band that played at the Bluebird in Bloomington ended up trading some sort of memorabilia with you for pizza.
And for the record, we changed our name to Rocket's Famous Pizza very shortly after opening, when it became apparent that my business partner had lifted the name from a hamburger franchise out west, which I met a few years ago. I finally saw that hamburger franchise. We got a cease and desist. So we had to scrap the Johnny from the name. But in the menu would open up, and there was this big story we had in the middle of the menu about Johnny Rocket and this kind of mythos of this guy who formed a pizza place and was a former musician who knew all these bands. We named, and this is, I don't know how this shit never got us in trouble, but we had bands named the Madonna and the Johnny Cash and the Fab Four, and I guess we were never big enough to reach those ears, so we never got those cease and desist orders. That started, I worked at this place called the Italian Villa. There was very few places in Bloomington that would hire freaks, people with earrings and tattoos or different color hair, leather jackets or whatever, little scrappy little punk rockers. Very few places would do it. The places that would most commonly were restaurants, because they could put you in the back end of the restaurant.
Right.
You could wash dishes and you could cook, and no one had to see you. And they could still, pay you minimum wage, which was like $3.13 an hour back in the early 80s. And, it was a good deal.
Yeah.
And the guy who did this, his name is Lou in the book. I'm going to try not to mention his real name. I always thought it was genius. You hire these freaks, give them a job, treat them like people, put your trust in your restaurant in their hands. And he garnered some loyalty doing that. He was a bit of he could be a little off the rails sometimes and had a temper like a junkyard dog.
There were a lot of people in the Bloomington music scene that worked at Leslie's Italian Villa, right?
Yes.
I know when I interviewed Deke Hager, he talked about.
I met Deke there.
Yeah, and who were some of the other folks from the local music?
There's Deke. There was John, the lead singer of Walking Ruins. Yeah, Tom Matthew, with the drummer for Go Mango. He worked there. There was this guy named Mel Talley, who was in this band called Toxin, which was kind of like the thrash metal band of Bloomington for a long time. And Mel was just kind of like this heavy metal pirate. He was just kind of sleazy and dirty and ass length long hair. So the owner of the Italian Villa, Lou, I'm gonna keep calling him Lou, approached me when I was the manager. I had built myself up from dishwasher all the way to the manager, and I was managing his restaurant. Kitchen manager. I ran the lines when the busiest nights of the week, and did it quite successfully. And he approached me one night because he had been out on the sidewalk in front of the restaurant looking up the street, and there's this giant line forming at the Hammerheads were playing, and just a line all the way down to the entrance of his restaurant. And it's a slow night, and he's just getting pissed looking at it. And, you know, because none of these kids are coming in to eat. And he's like, yeah, they could come in here and eat and then go to the... They're just standing out here in the cold. And then, this is before food trucks, but there was a couple guys that had hot dog carts. Yeah. They drive around, I forget, on bicycles, or they tow them with their car and they'd park them. One of these motherfuckers pulls up, starts selling hot dogs, and then just Frank's just... His brain is blowing up.
Yeah.
He's like, that's all my money sitting in those jeans of those college kids. But none of those kids were going to Leslie's. Was too nice for them to go to. But so he cooked up this idea of he read an article about the Hard Rock Cafe. He wanted something easy and quick that would make money. Yeah. He's like, what's the easiest thing that's the cheapest that makes the most money besides spaghetti? Pizza. It's dough and cheese and a little sauce and throw some ingredients on it. Yeah. And so he thought, you know, look at the Bluebird model of music. These kids lining up for music. I had a pizza place, and then a space up on the corner right next to the Bluebird opened up. And boom, he was on it. He rented the space, called me in his office one night and says, hey, I want you in on this. I need a partner. I had no money. I spent all my money on booze and coke. I got no money. We'll borrow some money from your parents. I need you in on this. So, you know, I don't know how I sold it to my parents. I don't know how they bought it, but they gave me a couple $1,000. And I bought into this restaurant and started putting it in action. And one of the early things was, you know, we need memorabilia to make this kind of a rock and roll place. So he goes down to Ace Pawn Shop and he buys all these funky instruments. Sousaphone, trombone, an accordion. I'm like, those aren't really rock and roll. Like, what are we doing here? I was like, how about these guitars? And he buys these two really cheesy looking axes.
Yeah.
And we get those, and then we start putting the restaurant together. He convinces my dad as part of helping me out to build a little bar along the side, and we painted it, and then we found a place up in Indianapolis to give us a jukebox. I got a list from John Barge. I got a list probably from Deke, from all the people I worked with. I was like, This is what I want. I want 50s through 70s rock and roll in this thing. I don't want anything new. I just made this huge list that I gave to the jukebox company. And I got about a third of what I wanted, and then they filled it with shit. So then I started going to record shows later on and doing what I do with records, just trolling through all these 45s, and I'd start replacing what I wanted. I don't think I had anything. I don't think any of our friends made the big hole 45s. At that time. I think CDs were really coming in the 90s. So everything was on CD. It was new and it was crisp and it was this great sound. And
what year did Rockets open up?
Rockets opened up in 1990. I sold it in 1996. Yeah. I don't know, who was your roommates at the time?
So Matt Schaefer worked for you?
Yeah, Matt, yeah.
Patrick Kelly.
Pat, the Viking. I see him all over town.
Angela Mitchell. So.
Matt Schaefer's girlfriends hated me. They were always calling on the fucking phone.
Yeah.
You know, there was no cell phones back then. There were cell phones, but they were these giant monstrosities that cost a shitload of money.
Yeah. And
college kids couldn't afford them. So, they were always calling. Can I talk to Matt? No, you can't fucking talk to Matt. He's working. Please, it's an emergency. What kind of emergency is it? Get out of here.
Right.
Call him later after work. You know, and then they would read him the Rad Act. It's like, dude, you gotta go a little lighter on my girlfriends. Man, I'm running a business here. What the fuck? But, you know, it was a great experience. It had tons of little kids. Partway through Rockets, veganism, which had always been kind of around, just kind of blossomed. Right. It was just kind of veganism and straight edge. There was a contingent of kids that came in the 90s that were really straight edge vegans and really into the hardcore and punk rock scene, and a lot of them were underage, so they were doing shows in their houses, and they would bring their bands that played on a Wednesday night.
Yeah.
So on a slow Wednesday night, all of a sudden I'd fill up with all these vegan kids. So I hired a bunch of them, and then they schooled me on what was good, and then I wound up hiring, and which presented its own problems sometimes. But like, dude, you got to make the pepperoni pizzas. I know it's a dead animal, and you're completely opposed to this, but you got to make it.
Yep.
You can't just wait for the vegetarian pizzas to come. No animal products whatsoever, but my leather jacket. Fuck that leather jacket. No, I like my leather jacket. Fuck you. He's like, what about the glue in your shoes? Isn't that made out of horses?
23 is pretty young to be.
Yeah, 23. It was. It's also, I got clean a year later, and became a straight edge kind of myself, because it was impossible to keep partying like I was partying and be a responsible restaurant owner.
Let's talk a little bit about the books. What made you decide to put all this down in print?
So I'd been thinking about it when I was working at Leslie's, we would joke around like, wouldn't this place be a great movie? And we'd all think about who would be our character, what actor would play us, Sean Penn or whoever the young actors were at the time. But so I always had it in the back of my mind that these weird little adventures I went on and these things that happened growing up were unique. They were unique time and place, and a lot of times, at least in the music part of it, it was skipped over whenever you'd see documentaries. And it was Sex Pistols, Nirvana. I was like, motherfuckers. So the way I started writing it down was, I sold rockets, moved on, started a family. I was working at this place, and they wanted to send me, send you at Ivy Tech. How do you feel about that? I was like, sure, I'll do it. What the hell? What could it hurt? So I went to Ivy Tech. I took all these courses. Two things I took was a speech class and a writing class. As the course went on, I wrote these stories. One of them, the last story in the first book, it's called The Fabulous Accident, about my friend Rob, who was this rock and roll maniac. Just because he was such a nut. He didn't even have to provide entertainment. All you needed to do was provide Robbie Mullet. And sit back and let it happen. He was such a fun guy to be around. I can't imagine him in his 40s. So I wrote that story. It was more of a shortened version of it. And I shared it with this group, all the kids in the class. I think I was in my 30s, late 30s at the time. And all these kids were just approaching 20, 21 maybe. And they just lost their mind. They're like, what? You lived like this? This happened in Bloomington? Oh my God, this is the greatest thing ever. And I was like, well, it had its up and downs. And it was the first time I realized that, that stuff that I found just completely hilarious and fun would be interesting to other people. Right. So, and then I wrote another one. The second one I wrote was my experience with a girlfriend who had died. My friend Mike's sister. And that's in the second book. And that was a lot shorter than it is in there. But so that kind of started it. And then I would share these stories.
You published your first book about 5 years ago? 4 or 5 years ago?
2019.
Okay.
This one was in 2019, right before the pandemic hit. Like kind of the end of 2019, I published this. And then I published the other one right in the middle of the pandemic. We were all at home. And I did not do much advertising. All my friends bought it. I sold a bunch online. I sold a bunch at a couple shows I've done.
What was the process of trying to get these memoirs published?
Oh, well, I asked my friends. I got people who have published stuff. Most of them for universities that they work for and stuff. But they gave me a kind of outline on what you do. And then I went online and I looked about, how other people do it, and found all of these. I tried to stay away from major publishing houses and go to these small publishing houses, and usually it's the same kind of thing. Like, send us the first 100 pages. synopsis of what the book's about, what the audience is, how they were going to market this book, why you think it's attractive to people. And I just got rejected time after time. At first, it was all in one thing. So it was 800 pages.
Right.
This is 2 books now.
Yeah.
But the first time, this guy from England's guy, dude, I cannot publish an 800-page book. Are you out of your goddamn mind? And I put that out there, this email I got, and people are like, yeah, you need to break those up.
Right.
You need to break that all up.
So what was the dividing line between the two stories?
The first book I wanted to be stories where I was just, things were going wrong. And the second one has the story about my rock and roll experience all around the Midwest where I've gone to see rock shows. And all the different bars around Bloomington and the people and the bands and little stories like that. And the second 2 stories in that book are about the girlfriend that died. One is kind of a third person while I'm processing it and trying to live a normal life, and the other one is when the event happened, and it's very intense. And then the last part of that is all the rocket stuff, and then growing up, and then what happened beyond that. But the first book was just all of the mishap kind of stuff that led to either experiences where you came out better at the end. All the best stories start with a bad decision. Each one of these stories, there's at least one bad decision. And sometimes they expose my hypocrisy growing up. And, I've got one where I'm incensed that this girl had given me the clap. Yeah. And had been cheating on me with all these, well, at least I thought she was cheating on me, and how dare she kind of thing. And then later on, I start macking on Robbie's girlfriend in another story. Yeah. So I'm doing the exact same fucking thing, but I wanted to expose the bits of hypocrisy and the fine lines between, when it happens to you as opposed to when you do it to someone else. Right. Perspective is a neat thing, and I was very careful in the first book to make sure and say, these are my versions of events. These are almost true stories. Yeah. Because in some of them I combine little bitty stories together, like nominal, epiphenomenal. The overarching part of that is me losing my bicycle and trying to find it one night when I'm really drunk. But in between it, there's lots of these little events that happen, like beating up the Nazis on Kirkwood and parties and friend to get stabbed at one of the parties. And so I haven't got too much pushback. People are like, yeah, that's not the way it happened. And I'm like, okay, I'm not changing it, Right. So,
are there any particular stories that you would like to share?
Glenn Danzig had formed Samhain sometime after the legendary East Coast band The Misfits broke up. He was the voice of the band, kind of a cross between Elvis and Jim Morrison and Vox, singing songs straight out of the Alice Cooper playbook. They were a little edgier, with easy hooks and a sing-along quality that you couldn't resist. They took metal and the panache of Kiss and layered it with the Saturday Night Horror Show flavor and a big dash of punk rock snark. When they delivered it to our teenage brains with all the ghoul-driven virility of a big band like Motley Crue, and it was hard not to like them. They came to our little space and delivered their brand of punk rock with a hard and earnest intent, and we loved them for it. What they loved about Bloomington, however, wasn't our enthusiasm or our fan-driven knowledge of their songs, and it certainly wasn't the pay they got for playing to 100 kids in a little dive of a space in a college town in the middle of the country. No, what they liked about Bloomington were our girls. Granted, the female punk rock population of Bloomington were, and are, some of the most beautiful women on the planet. More importantly, unlike a lot of other punk rock scenes around the country, there were a lot of girls in ours. In Bloomington, punk rock was not a boys' club. Samhain acted like, and in some respects were treated like, celebrities. There was a swagger in their walk and no small amount of pretension around them, and although most of the girls in our tribe didn't cater to the notion of entitled renown, some of them were clearly starstruck. There was one girl who only hung around us when they were in town. The girl's name was Sonia. Not to be confused with my wife, Sonia, just so we're clear. And to hear her tell it, she was a professional groupie. Now this was high school, and this girl just appeared one day, an import from Texas, trying to regale all the punk rockers with their ability to get backstage and get with the band, whatever band was playing. She had a laundry list of minor celebrities she had slept with and took pride in bragging about it to us. The more she talked, the more we looked at each other with doubt and disgust in our eyes. Needless to say, we were not impressed. The night of the first show at Ricky's Cantina, she came with her very clean, very new punk rock accessories and ornaments on display. For lower and middle class kids with secondhand clothes, beat up leather jackets, her Gucci cheek very ostentatious and off. Her Gucci cheek was very ostentatious and off-putting. Nobody outright belittled her fashionable version of punk rock, but we weren't wowed by it by any means. There certainly wasn't a crowd of people talking or in any meaningful way interacting with her, in a manner that was sad, but kind of warranted. We shunned her. To Sam Hain, though, she was a beacon of teenage lust. They knew immediately what her deal was and welcomed her into the back of their panel truck. Later that night, she was seen at an after-event party with two members of the band making out first near the cars outside and then later by people in the basement. The house we were partying in was called Harold and Alice, and when invited to come along, the band graciously accepted. I ran into Erie Vaughn and Glenn Danzig outside the house. Now, being 17 and eager to show them how cool I was, I offered to get them a beer. "No, thank you. Seen that little red-headed girl?" Erie asked. No, Mr. Creepy Man," I thought to myself. "Can I get you a beer, Glenn?" "I don't drink beer, man. Only red wine." He held up a big bottle. It was large and green and had a cork in it, which he pulled out with his teeth. Why?" I asked. "Makes your blood thick," he said matter-of-factly. "Oh," I said like I knew what the hell he was talking about. "Yeah, man, you need thick blood." "I do? Of course. You want some?" He held the bottle up. "Sure," I reached for it. No. I'll pour it in. I don't want your lips on my bottle. Open up." "So, I said, like I was at the doctor. "There, thick blood," he said, pouring my mouth full of wine. I swallowed and said thanks. Later on, I would hold out a cup for some more, which he filled up a quarter of the way before telling me to get lost. My wine drinking experience with Glenn Danzig would last all of 2 minutes. I'm not sure why you want thick blood. Quick search on the internet tells me that's not a good thing to have. Another thing that happened that night at H&A, and is also something that everyone remembers the most about Glenn Danzig and his time in Bloomington, although depending on who you talk to, the story is slightly different. I've heard at least 2 versions in addition to my own, and that is the incident with the beer. In the early 80s in Bloomington, Indiana, beer was not yet a mainstay of our party focus. We were more concerned with just having fun. Beer was a way to get there, but it hadn't become the main ingredient yet. Half the time we were content just to throw it at each other than we were to actually drink the stuff. We found it funny that a 16-year-old would have to return home smelling like a brewery and try to explain it to their unbelieving parents that they weren't drunk and that one of their friends had just thrown beer on them. We thought it was funny as hell. That is an excuse that is only going to work once, if at all. Beer fights were common at parties around this time, more so than actually getting wasted. So this was the environment Sam Hain stepped into that night. More specifically, Glenn Danzig stepped into. Glenn was doing on the porch at Harold House, drinking wine and holding court like some kind of punk rock emperor, trying to impress the peasantry with his presence, when my friend Kate came up behind him and poured a cup of beer over his head. I know why she did it, and the people on the porch I'm pretty sure knew why she did it, but poor Glenn Danzig was clueless. To him, this was an unwarranted assault. Without even pausing to ask why someone would do this, he spun around and punched her in the stomach. Kate fell to the porch as the air was pushed violently out of her lungs. Glenn stood about her with his fist clenched. This was the moment I walked out the front door. "What is going on?" I asked Brat, who was watching from a ragged bar stool next to the door. I had no idea Glenn Danzig had punched her. "Oh, Kate just poured a beer on Glenn Danzig's head," he chuckled. "You stupid bitch, I'll kick your ass. I'm Glenn Danzig. Nobody fucking does that to me. Who the fuck do you think you are?" There was probably more outrage of a similar nuance, but I was paying more attention to Kate, whose face had gone from surprisingly alarmed to very much amused. Even though she was gasping for air, there was a huge grin on her face. After a little more verbiage, he stood up, turned back to the people he was talking to, and turned his back on Kate. The people on the porch were looking at him in wide-eyed disbelief, as he explained that actions have consequences and you get what you deserve, before going back into his previous discussion about the occult or whatever the fuck it was he was talking about. Kate picked herself up off the floor, looked around, Seeing what she needed, she grabbed an almost empty beer can out of the nearest kid's hand and dumped its contents on Glenn Danzig's head. Again, Glenn visibly tensed up, shook his head, muttered a curse, and no more punches were thrown. Kate was content to get the last word.
It has been a pleasure to talk to you and hear these stories. Your efforts to collect the memories were partially inspiring to me to want to do this podcast.
Oh, great. So. And probably should mention that the Monroe County Historical Museum, where some of these shows took place, including 2 from Glenn Danzig, is now actively collecting our memorabilia from that time and place. Right. Flyers, zines, records, if we have them to give, and things like that. And they plan on, in 2024, having an exhibit of the Bloomington underground and not so underground music scene. So I would encourage anyone who has that stuff, and it was sitting like it was sitting in my house, in a big old trunk in the basement, gathering mold, gathering dust, take it over to the Monroe County Museum, tell them what it is, and donate it. They've got 2 of my books, they've got all of my flyers, any of the zines I still have, they have those, and they would love some more. And I think it's important to document what went on in Bloomington. We were a little cog in a bigger machine, but it was important to us, and I think it was important to the county. So when you see that kid at Starbucks with the blue mohawk and the tattoos and the pierced nose, you go, hey, you ever been to the Monroe County Historical Museum? See where all this started? It'll be there for them.
Well, thanks again.
Yeah, maybe you can make it to the show. I will be reading at that.
You will be reading at it?
Yeah, at the beginning of it.
So. Nice.